The 1930s were a turbulent time for America's railroads, with cars emerging onto the scene and the Great Depression hurting business. To get back in the game, they needed something new. Streamlined, diesel-powered trains seemed to be the answer. But it was clear that steam wouldn't back down without a fight. Greater quantities of passengers, as well as freight, needed to be moved, and the race was on to establish motive-powered dominance. Steam had been tried and tested for more than a century, but in order to survive, the steam engines of the future would need to win over clients with technological ingenuity and tasteful styling. The world looked to these machines to drag them out of the Depression and whisk them away to a brighter tomorrow. From America to the far-flung reaches of Europe, they all witnessed the power of steam against the current. In the land of the free, newcomers wouldn't have guessed that the world's greatest superpower was having financial difficulty. Productivity and rise of employment meant more travel and higher production of goods. Even though highways made shipping with trucks more convenient for door-to-door deliveries, nothing could beat the mile-long strings of freight cars to deliver the goods from the Pittsburgh factories to the San Francisco harbors. But it was still a common sight for the freight train to take the whole and let the limited or the streamliner overtake. It seemed like every week, a new streamliner would hit the rails between every corner of the nation and everywhere else in between. On May 3rd, 1939, one of the biggest corners of the country was unified under one roof. In Los Angeles, the Santa Fe, Southern Pacific, and Union Pacific all arrived and departed from two separate stations. Yet they all set aside their differences to put on the best grand opening they could possibly stage for the new Los Angeles Union Passenger Terminal. They paraded the best of their fleet down the middle of Alameda Street, with 19th century locomotives in rolling stock, along with contemporary motive power decked from dome to running gear in flags, bunting, and signs signifying a new age. Altogether, they kicked off the opening of one of America's last great train stations in grand style, all without a diesel in sight. The first train to leave LAUPT was a special excursion bound for Omaha, pulled by two very unconventional steam-electric locomotives. In 1939, there was nothing else like them. Union Pacific and General Electric had collaborated to produce a machine that could produce 2,500 horsepower and could reach 125 miles per hour with double the conventional locomotive's thermal efficiency. Instead of diesel fuel, bunker C oil was fed to water tube boilers provided by Babcock and Wilcox, which were regulated automatically by specialized equipment that could maintain boiler pressure as high as 1,600 psi. This ultra-high pressure steam would be fed to turbines, which were connected to a generator set that produced electricity to power the traction motors. They carried the outward appearance of a typical diesel locomotive with some of their functionality too. They could be operated together with one crew, they could supply electricity to the passenger cars for lights, heating, or air conditioning, and they sported a new type of brakes, where the polarity of the traction motors could be reversed to reduce the kinetic energy turning the wheels. Rather than dissipate the energy as heat, the resistors were water-cooled by steam loops, which in turn captured the kinetic energy for use as more power for the boilers. This made them the only condensing locomotives to ever run in America, which could extend their range by hundreds of miles. The units showed great acceleration and a greater ability to keep the time than conventional steam power, but were held back by high maintenance costs and frequent reliability problems. GE would take the units back to Erie for further modification, but UP was no longer interested in the experiment and declined to take them back. They would stagger in freight service on the New York Central and Great Northern until 1943. Low points and downfalls were to be expected in unproven technology after all, especially at a time when recovering from the worst economic downturn in modern history. Overall improvement had been moving in leaps and bounds, with traffic levels for passengers and freight almost back to their pre-depression levels. The most notable difference since that time was the outward appearance of not just the trains themselves, but seemingly the entire environment around them. The term Art Deco was used like a fashion trend, becoming evident in nearly every facet of everyday life. cars, buildings, art, jewelry, clothing, furnishings, and kitchen appliances. For many, the 1930s would be epitomized by this style of art. Only one place had what it took to wind up the decade by showing not just how far civilization had come, but how breakthroughs in the present could pave the way for the future. The World's Fair was 1,216 acres of land next to Manhattan, dedicated to showing the best qualities of living on planet Earth. With General Motors as a sponsor, they demonstrated their feat with a light show and a conceptual model of a city based entirely on automotive transportation. Guests to their pavilion were greeted by an E4 diesel streamliner, specially painted and sectioned to demonstrate the new technology. While it marked the entrance into their vision of the future, this locomotive did not, however, participate in the railroad pageant. The railroads went all out in showing their evolution, with trains from the previous century running through the middle of a stage with actors and moving set pieces. They reenacted some of the most glorious and most coveted moments in the history of the industry. The creation of the Baltimore and Ohio, the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Summit, and the continuing improvement in passenger rail travel. After showing off the standard railroad equipment of the day, the future took center stage. Two streamlined giants inched towards each other. One was a Pennsylvania Railroad K4, draped in sheet metal by Raymond Loewy, and appointed as the main motive power of the premier Broadway Limited. Sitting across from her was her arch nemesis, the Dreyfuss Hudson. The streamlining was commissioned by the New York Central for 10 of these J3 Hudsons to be styled by Henry Dreyfuss. In his work, Dreyfuss did not think of himself as a stylist. Unlike most industrial designers, he often applied common sense and science to counteract problems. The most common problem with streamlined steam locomotives was the attractive shrouding, often covering up areas and components that needed maintenance. On these Hudsons, Dreyfuss left open the massive 79-inch disc drivers with Baker valve gear, glorifying the poetry in motion rather than hiding it. Casing was fitted along the top of the boiler to cover up the stack and the domes, while the shrouding clung to the boiler with exposed piping. Only the front was shrouded, with the nose resembling the fin of a Roman warrior. All it took was an overhead crane to remove the nose cone and open the smokebox door to clean out the ashes. From pilot to drawbar to coupler, the Hudson's charisma teamed Dreyfuss's personal taste for design with the best incarnation of the world's most popular train to date. What's more, it was these engines that shaved 2 hours off the travel time between Chicago and New York City to just 16 hours, the century's shortest travel time ever. As an exhibition of technological progress, two railroads were eager to show off what they believed was the next logical step in the locomotive's evolution. In the pursuit of reducing hammer blow, the Baldwin Locomotive Works studied the articulated locomotive principle very closely. What made them so versatile was their hinged frame, so they could slalom around tight curves. But Baldwin reckoned that the frame should be rigid on the same wheelbase as a typical locomotive, but with the running gear split in half. By spreading out the thrust from the cylinders to reduce reciprocating mass with smaller and more efficient pistons, the so-called duplex-type locomotive could operate as well as a contemporary engine while being less taxing on the rails. Baldwin had planned to build a Demonstrator Locomotive to show off the advantages to railroads, but became distracted with orders from two major railroads to build one example each for the fair. The Baltimore and Ohio presented N1 number 5600, George H. Emerson. Named after the chief of motive power who brought it to life, it perfectly fit the dimensions of the road's contemporary mountains, with the second cylinders positioned back to front. This was intended to preserve the engine's wheelbase, but it caused the cylinders to be made smaller to fit with the firebox, which overheated them and spewed interfering coal dust on them. The other duplex, Pennsylvania S1 number 6100, has all of its cylinders facing forward. This mammoth 6446 was the longest locomotive in the world at 140 feet from coupler to coupler and so made her debut by sitting on rollers in the rails that let her wheels turn in place. With her striking bullet nose and stainless steel trim, also styled by Loewy, 6100 was one of many engines at the fair that signaled the end of the Depression, new age of prosperity, and just maybe, the future of steam. Also in attendance was his Canadian National Confederation. At the fair, U4A number 6400 met nose-to-nose with the Dreyfuss, in symbolization of an actual meeting. A month earlier, the reigning majesties of Britain, King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, had been touring the Dominion of Canada via its two major railroads. Taking them west was a single, streamlined Hudson, which pulled the train the entire 3,224 miles from Quebec City to Vancouver across the Canadian Pacific. With this record, and His Majesty's permission, CP streamliners became known as Royal Hudsons. CN, meanwhile, provided 4 locomotives to transport their Majesties back east to Niagara Falls, where American locomotives carried them to Washington. The specially painted Confederation had brought the royal couple to a meeting with President Franklin D. Roosevelt and Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. Conflict was threatening to become war in Europe, and Britain needed to strengthen its bond with its allies. When it came to the royal train, there was no better way to achieve diplomacy than by taking their case directly to the people. For so many steam engines to attend an event made to epitomize the future, the only diesel locomotive to have been documented in attendance was the lone E unit at the GM Pavilion. Despite the outward appearance of change, the railroad's prominence at the fair gave the impression that the world's future was still all steam all the way. But change was also taking place outside of the fairgrounds. For the first time ever, steam faced a worthy opponent. FT was a diesel-electric streamliner for hauling freight. The Demonstrator set, released in November, was actually 4 units coupled together, yet operated with one man. The F stood for 1,400 horsepower, rounded up from the A unit's actual rating of 1,350. The T meant twin, meaning the cab A unit and booster B unit were permanently coupled together with a drawbar. Now as a division of General Motors, everything that was known about the technology was applied to the FT. Orders came in droves. Placed alongside a steam engine, it was no contest. Their grand total power output would be at 5,400 horsepower, well above most operating steamers at the time. FTs had better weight distribution, allowing them to ride over lighter bridges and rails to more places on the system. They wouldn't need to stop so often for maintenance or to take on fuel, meaning there was more time saved, better reliability, and lesser employees required to operate. By complementing the streamliners and the switchers, entire divisions were dieselized one by one. Steam had come a long way during the decade, but nothing could change how they were still dirty, labor-intensive, and more strenuous to keep going. On September 3rd, 1939, war was declared in Europe. Watching from afar, most American citizens and companies could sense the gravity of the situation over there, and how that same gravity could very well pull the country into the thick of the fighting. As the home of the brave, though, they all wanted to be ready.